The 12 links are not a cycle. The Buddha mapped how suffering builds and where to intervene. Your breath shortens. There is a small contraction in your chest. You would not have noticed it unless you were looking for it. A thought begins to form. Not a full thought yet. A shape. Something like, "That's not fair," or "They're wrong about me," or "I need to respond to this." 5 seconds ago, that thought did not exist. 5 seconds ago, the version of you that is now preparing a reply, the one with a position, a grievance, a status to defend, did not exist either. And now it does. A self has been born into a room it was not occupying before. You have 10 seconds, maybe 15, before the next thing happens. The body will finish its reaction. The thought will finish its sentence. The mouth will open or not open. Both are already committed. The machinery is turning. What just happened? 2,500 years ago, the Buddha gave an answer that is among the most precise and least understood teachings in the entire Pali Canon. He did not say, "Craving causes suffering," and stop there. He traced the process backward and forward through 12 linked events that run continuously in the mind. 12 conditions, each one giving rise to the next. And then, this is the part most people miss, he ran the chain in reverse. 12 conditions, each ceasing with the cessation of the one before, until the entire mass of suffering ceases. This is paṭicca-samuppāda, dependent co-arising. And inside these 12 links, the Buddha identified something you might call the weakest link. Not the root cause, not the beginning. The place in the chain where the whole structure is most vulnerable to intervention. The place where, if you could train yourself to stand for a single breath, the rest of the machinery would lose its grip. That is what this video is about. Where the chain is, how it runs, where it breaks. A warning first, one the Buddha himself gave. The setting is the country of the Kurus, at a town called Kamasadhamma. The Buddha's attendant, Ānanda, the one who remembered more sutras than anyone else, comes to him and says something that, on the surface, sounds modest. He says that dependent co-arising is amazing, that it seems as clear can be. DN 15. The Buddha's reply is one of the few moments in the canon where he directly corrects his own cousin and closest attendant. He says, "Don't say that, Ānanda. Don't say that. Deep is this dependent co-arising, and deep its appearance." And then he adds that it is precisely because this teaching is not understood that, in his words, this generation is like a tangled skein, a knotted ball of string, like matted rushes and reeds. So the first thing to say is this: the teaching is deep. We are going to walk through it carefully. I am going to point at the structure, one link at a time. I am going to tell you what each link is, what it feels like from the inside, and what the Buddha said conditions its arising. I am going to do my best not to oversimplify, and at the end, I am going to show you where the weakest link is, and what it takes to stand there. One more piece of framing, because it changes everything. There is a common picture of the 12 links as a wheel. You may have seen it, the Tibetan bhava, the wheel of becoming, painted with realms and demons around its rim. There is another picture from the medieval Chinese tradition of a circle of mirrors, each reflecting the others endlessly. The Thai forest monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu, whose translations I am following throughout this episode, argues against both of these pictures. His reason is practical, not scholarly. If the chain is a wheel, you cannot get off it. A wheel under any condition just turns faster or slower. If the chain is a circle of mirrors, it has no exit, because every point reflects every other point equally. Thanissaro's reading is different. He argues that the 12 links form something more like a complex, dynamical system, with feedback loops that cross and re-enter, with self-similarity across scale, with parameter points where a small change in one factor changes the behavior of the whole. He uses analogies from weather, from fluid dynamics, from bridges under stress, and he makes one claim that I want to sit with, because it is the foundation of the rest of this video. This is my paraphrase of his position, not a direct quote. The chain's complexity is precisely what makes it dismantleable from within. A simple, linear mechanism would just continue. It is the intricate structure, the feedback loops, the parameter sensitivity, the multiple points of leverage that allows sustained clarity at any one link to begin unraveling the whole. That is the promise of this teaching. Not escape by transcendence, not escape by sheer effort against a mechanism. Escape by seeing the mechanism well enough at any one of its points that the mechanism stops being able to sustain itself. 2 more notes before we begin. First, translations. The Pali word dukkha I will render, following Thanissaro, as stress, or sometimes as stress and suffering, to capture the everyday texture of the word alongside its darker weight. Saṅkhāra I will render as fabrications, the active shaping of experience, which is Thanissaro's distinctive choice. Upādāna I will render as clinging or clinging in sustenance, preserving the Pali's double sense of grasping and of taking in fuel. And paṭicca-samuppāda itself I will render as dependent co-arising rather than the more common dependent origination, to emphasize that these factors arise together, not merely in sequence. Other translators make other choices. These are Thanissaro's. Second, the number 12. This is the most common count, but the canon preserves shorter versions. In the Maha-Nidana Sutta itself, the very sutta we have already quoted, the Buddha presents the chain with 9 links rather than 12, omitting ignorance, fabrications, and the 6 sense media, DN 15. We will come back to why this matters. For now, 12 is the standard articulation and the one we will walk through. Just know the number is not fixed. And finally, 2 brief connections to what you have seen on this channel before, if you have seen it. In episode 3 of the Meeting Point series, we said that nothing exists alone. This episode fills in the internal version of that claim, that nothing arises alone in your mind either. And in episode 4, on craving, we examined the origin of suffering. This episode shows where craving itself comes from, and what, downstream of craving, it sets in motion. 12 links. Ready. ACT1, the infrastructure. The first 6 links set the conditions of the territory. They do not yet produce suffering in its loud form. They build the room in which suffering will later appear. If you miss them, you will look for suffering in the wrong place, in craving, in clinging, in loss, and you will be right about those things, but you will have walked past the foundation already laid. Link 1, avijjā, ignorance. In the Vibhanga Sutta, SN 12.2, the Buddha gives this a precise definition. Avijjā, he says, is not knowing stress, not knowing the origination of stress, not knowing the cessation of stress, not knowing the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. 4 pieces of not knowing. The 4 noble truths, unknown. But what does that feel like? Here is something important. Ignorance, as the Buddha uses the word, is not a feeling of confusion. It is not the feeling of being lost. a person who feels lost is already partway out of ignorance, because they at least feel that something is missing. Avijjā is the opposite. Avijjā feels like nothing. It is the transparent medium of the unexamined life. It is what it feels like to react to a stimulus without ever asking, what just arose? Where did it come from? Where is it going? It is the water in which the reaction swims, unnoticed because never looked for. Thanissaro, in an essay on ignorance, offers a reading I find clarifying. He notes that the Pali word for knowledge, vijjā, is used in the suttas the way we would use the word skill. A doctor has vijjā, medical skill. An animal trainer has vijjā. It is operational knowledge, the kind that works, which means avijjā, the negation, is not mere lack of information. It is lack of skill, and specifically lack of skill in handling one's own experience. Thanissaro's teacher, Ajahn Suwat, had a blunter word for it: stupidity, not insult, diagnosis. The stupidity of holding on to strategies that do not work and insisting on using them again. The person operating under avijjā is not passive. They are actively using strategies. The strategies just do not see the structure of the suffering they produce. So picture not darkness, but a kind of unnoticed opacity, someone operating in conditions they cannot see the shape of, while being completely convinced they can. Every reaction they have is a strategy. None of the strategies open the four questions. What is this suffering? Where does it come from? Can it end? What is the path? The first time you hear those four questions, really hear them, not as doctrine, but as questions about your own life. Avijjā becomes briefly visible, and that visibility is already the beginning of its end. Link 2, saṅkhāra, fabrications. Conditioned by ignorance, fabrications arise. The Vibhanga Sutta tells us there are three types: bodily fabrications, verbal fabrications, and mental fabrications. This is, in some ways, the strangest link in the chain, the one that students ask about most, and commentators disagree about most. Think of it this way. Before you meet the world in this moment, the world has already been pre-shaped. Your posture is already set before the next thing happens to you. That is bodily fabrication. The inner murmur of thought and evaluation that precedes your next sentence is already underway. That is verbal fabrication. The tone of attention you bring to whatever arises, the quality of mood you are meeting the world with. That is mental fabrication. Ignorance fabricates. Not knowing the shape of stress, you are already, before contact with the next moment, assembling the conditions in which stress will arise. Your body arrives pre-tensed. Your inner voice arrives pre-scripted. Your mind arrives pre-colored. Experience does not come to you raw. It arrives pre-packaged by the fabrications that ran just before it did. One quick technical note, because it will matter later for anyone who studies this closely. The Buddha uses the word saṅkhāra in more than one framework. The three fabrications we have just described appear in MN 44, the Kula Vedala Sutta, where the nun Dhammadinna explains them. In another framework, the five aggregates, saṅkhāra is the fourth aggregate, the aggregate of volitional formations in general. Same Pali word, different classifications. For the second link in the chain of dependent co-arising, the three fabrications framework is the relevant one. We are talking about the shaping that happens before contact. The infrastructure of experience is already under construction before experience arrives. Link 3, viññāṇa, consciousness. Conditioned by fabrications, consciousness arises. And here, the Vibhanga Sutta says something that is easy to miss if you come to this teaching. Assuming consciousness means one thing. a continuous inner witness, a unified awareness behind the eyes. It does not. The Buddha's viññāṇa in the chain comes in 6 classes: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and intellect consciousness. SN 12:2. 6 consciousnesses, 1% door, arising, passing away, plural, conditioned. In the Mahātāṇha Sutta, MN 38, the Buddha offers a fire simile that is useful here. A fire is named for what it burns: a wood fire, a grass fire, a cow dung fire. You do not find a fire existing somewhere independently that then takes on different fuels. Consciousness works the same way. Eye consciousness is not a permanent awareness that happens to be looking through the eye today. It is the lighting up that occurs when eye, visible form, and attention converge, and it is named, classified, and constrained by that convergence. This matters for the chain because it means the viññāṇa that gets conditioned by fabrications is not a permanent knower. It is a momentary event of cognition, already shaped by what came before, already plural, already passing. Link 4, Namarupa, name and form. Conditioned by consciousness, name and form. And here we arrive at a link worth slowing down for, because, as we will see, it contains one of the 2 most strategic intervention points in the entire chain. The Vibhanga Sutta gives us precise definitions. Name, nama, is defined as feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. The mental side of experience, the side that categorizes, interprets, directs. Form, rupa, is defined as the 4 great elements and form derived from them. The physical side, weight, solidity, material. Notice what is inside name, attention, the direction of the mental light. Whatever you are currently attending to is being pulled into the interpretation apparatus of name. And whatever you are not attending to is being organized as background. Before you notice that you have noticed, the noticing is already organized. Your attention is already on certain features of this situation and not on others. That organization is not a neutral camera recording whatever is there. It is part of the mechanism. This is why attention inside Namarupa is an intervention point. The quality of attention, what the suttas call appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara, is the operational lever by which, moment by moment, you can begin to convert this link from a producer of suffering into a factor of the path. We will return to this. There is one more feature of this link worth naming. In the Maha-nidana Sutta, DN 15, the Buddha describes a mutual dependency between Namarupa and viññāṇa. He asks Ānanda, if consciousness were not to descend into the womb, would name and form take shape? Ānanda answers, no, Lord. The Buddha asks, if consciousness were to depart, would name and form be produced? Again, no, Lord. And then the reverse. If name and form were not established, would consciousness have a foothold? No. Each is requisite condition for the other. Neither can be reduced to the other. Consciousness needs something to be conscious of. Name and form need something to light it up. This is the 9-link version of the chain, and it is why DN 15 can drop ignorance, fabrications, and the 6th sense media entirely. Because this mutual loop between consciousness and name and form is, in that presentation, the core of the whole apparatus. Link 5, Salayatana, the 6th sense media. Conditioned by name and form, the 6th sense media arise. Eye medium, ear, nose, tongue, body, and intellect medium. The temptation is to read this as, well, obviously, We have 6 senses. What is there to say? What there is to say is this. The 6 sense media in the chain are not neutral windows onto a pre-existing world. They are conditioned apparatus. They arise because of name and form, which means the very instruments of perception are products of the earlier links, shaped by them, constrained by them. Another way of putting it, you are not behind your sense doors looking out. You are the 6 sense doors, configured by the history of your own fabrications and the operation of your own consciousness. The apparatus of experience is itself a product of the chain. It did not arrive independently. It was built by what came before it. Why does this matter? Because any theory of intervention that treats the sense doors as fixed will miss one of the places where practice actually takes hold. The sense doors can be retrained. Attention at a sense door can be cultivated. The quality of what arrives through a door depends on the conditions of the door itself, not just on what is sent toward it. Link 6, phassa, contact. Conditioned by the 6 sense media, contact. 6 classes of contact, 1 for each sense door. Contact is the moment at which sense faculty, sense object, and the corresponding consciousness all converge. Eye, visible form, and eye consciousness meeting, that is, eye contact. And the Maha-Nidana Sutta adds something that turns out to be important. The Buddha tells Ānanda that every contact has 2 faces. There is designation contact, the side of contact that is directed at name, at meaning, at mental interpretation. And there is resistance contact, the side that is directed at form, at the bump of the physical, at solidity, DN 15. Every meeting of mind and world is already double, already interpreted, already physical, already split into significance and substance before you notice it. I want to resist the urge to dwell here too long. Contact in the chain is the faint click of the world meeting the door. It is short. It is the point at which the infrastructure we have been describing actually touches an event. In a single moment of experience, contact happens and passes in less time than it takes to name it. The infrastructure is in place. 6 links: ignorance, fabrications, consciousness, name and form. 6 sense media, contact. None of them, yet, is what most people would call suffering. None of them is craving. None of them is loss. They are the conditions under which the next 6 links will run. And the next 6 links are where the machinery visibly turns. Act 2. The machinery. The machinery is what runs on top of the infrastructure. If the first 6 links built the room, these next 6 are what happens inside it. The movement, the grasping, the becoming, the appearing, the aging, the dying. This is where the chain shows its face, where a sensation becomes a craving, becomes a clinging, becomes a self, becomes a situation, becomes a loss, where suffering, which was latent in the conditions of the first 6 links, becomes the visible fact of the next 6. And I should note at the start of this half that the pacing here will be uneven. 2 of these links, feeling and craving, we examined in depth in episode 4 of the Meeting Point series. We will pass through them with a light touch and return to feeling, in particular in the next act of this episode, where it turns out to be the place where the whole structure is most vulnerable. 3 of the middle links, clinging, becoming, and birth, I want to slow down for, because they are the parts of the chain most often misunderstood. And the last link we will treat with the full weight of its 5 tones, because the Buddha was not being poetic when he listed them. Link 7, Vedana, feeling. Conditioned by contact, feeling arises. The Vibhanga Sutta gives 6 classes, one for each sense door, the feeling born of eye contact, of ear contact, and so on. SN 12:2. 3 tones, pleasant, painful, neither pleasant nor painful. The framework given in DN 15. One caution: Vedana is not emotion. Emotion is a much later construction. Vedana is the bare tone, the faint yes or no or neither that every contact carries. Before you know what you are looking at, the looking has a tone. Before you know what you are hearing, the hearing has a tone. 3 tones, instantaneous, irreducible. We will return to this link. It turns out to be the most important link in the chain for practice. But the architecture of it we built in episode 4, and I do not want to redo that work here. Link 8, tanha, craving. Conditioned by feeling, craving arises. 6 classes of craving, 1 per sense door. 3 types: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. The formulation the Buddha gave in the first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, SN 5611. This is the pivot of the 4 noble truths. This is the link the Buddha called the origin of suffering. This is the architecture of episode 4, and we spent nearly an hour inside it. If you have not seen that episode and any of this sounds abstract, go back. What we said there about feeding will illuminate the link we are about to reach. Brief, then. Feeling gives rise to craving. The tone becomes a pull. And pull by pull, the machinery downstream begins to engage. Link 9, upādāna, clinging. Conditioned by craving, clinging arises. And here we reach one of the Pali terms that is most interesting in translation. Upādāna has 2 senses in Pali. The first sense, the one almost every translator captures, is clinging, grasping, holding on. The second sense, which Thanissaro Bhikkhu preserves in his English and which most other translators let go of, is sustenance, fuel, the act of taking up that which feeds. Upādāna is what a fire does to its wood. Upādāna is what a living body does to its food. It is not just psychological grip, it is active feeding. The Vibhanga Sutta gives 4 types. There is sensuality clinging, the feeding of the senses on their objects. There is view clinging, the feeding of the mind on its opinions. There is habit and practice clinging, the feeding of the self on its routines, its techniques, its religious or professional forms. And there is doctrine of self-clinging, the feeding of identity on the idea that there is a self there to be identified. SN 12:2. Craving reaches, clinging takes in, and here the double meaning matters. What you cling to, you are also feeding on. What you feed on becomes the fuel of the next stage of the chain. This is why Thanissaro has an essay titled, "To feed is to suffer." Every feeding costs the eater. Every act of clinging to an object pulls the object inside, makes the self that clings depend upon it, and sets up the next link, the becoming of a self organized around that fuel. Craving wants, clinging eats. Link 10, bhava, becoming. Conditioned by clinging, becoming arises. And here we need to slow down, because this is one of the most misunderstood links in the chain, and also one of the most revealing. The Vibhanga Sutta gives 3 becomings: sensual becoming, form becoming, and formless becoming. SN 12:2. In later tradition, these are often read cosmologically as realms of rebirth, kingdoms of existence. Thanissaro, in his book titled The Paradox of Becoming, offers a reading that is equally valid and, for our purposes here, more immediately useful. Bhava, he says, is a sense of identity in a particular world of experience. 3 grades from the most embodied and sensory to the most subtle. Let me give a concrete example. Back to the meeting. The feeling arose at contact. The craving followed. The clinging pulled the situation inside, fed on the sentence that was spoken, fed on the opinion formed, fed on the stake in the outcome. And now, at link 10, a becoming has occurred. There is a world now, a small internal world in which a debate is happening, in which there are sides, in which one side is yours, in which winning and losing are possible. And there is an occupant of that world, the self of the one who needs to win this argument. That occupant did not exist a minute ago. It came into being at this link. There is a paradox embedded in bhava that Thanissaro names in his book, and that I want to at least touch on before moving. To end becoming, which is what the Buddha proposes we do, requires, for as long as the path is being walked, a certain kind of becoming. There must be an occupant of the world in which the path is practiced. There must be a self who sits down to meditate, who undertakes the precepts, who returns to the breath. The path is not built by the abolition of becoming on day 1. It is built by a skillful becoming, one that works itself out of a job. This is why the teaching is delicate. You cannot club the self into non-existence. You have to train a self that, through its training, comes to see that it was never quite there to begin with. Link 11, jāti, birth. Conditioned by becoming, birth arises. And here we come to the link that most of us experience dozens of times a day without ever noticing. Jāti is the Pali word for birth. The Vibhanga Sutta gives a list: birth, taking birth, descent, coming to be, coming forth, appearance of aggregates, and acquisition of sense media. SN 12:2. Later tradition reads this, again cosmologically, the biological birth of a being into a womb. That reading is present in the canon. It is not wrong. But if we stay only there, we miss what the Buddha's chain is describing in every moment of our daily experience. Because in every moment of our daily experience, jāti happens. Jāti is not only biological birth. Jāti is the moment a situation has a new occupant. It is the event in which, out of the becoming of a little world, there now is a being who lives in that world. Let me give several examples, because this is where the chain is most recognizable. You are sitting in a meeting. Someone says something. 5 seconds later, there is someone in the room who has been wronged. That someone was not there before. A birth has occurred. A self with a grievance, a position, a stake. The one who was wronged has come into being. You are reading news at your kitchen table. A headline lands. 5 seconds later, there is the citizen who is losing their country, or the parent who is failing the next generation, or the voter whose side was betrayed. None of those selves existed an hour ago. They are births, each one born of a particular chain of contact and feeling and craving and clinging. You are at dinner with your family. A relative tells a story. 5 seconds later, there is the one whose story is better, or the one who knows the real version, or the one who is being spoken over again, as always. Born, occupant, small world, new being. Birth, in the chain, is not a single event at the start of a life. It is one of the most common events in a day. A self is born whenever a becoming has prepared the ground for it. And the suffering the Buddha is tracing is not just the suffering of being physically born once. It is the cumulative weight of being psychologically born into one small grievance world after another, over and over, thousands of times, every day. Let us sit with that. Let me not rush past it. Because if you can see this link clearly, just once, just in a single afternoon, something about the chain becomes impossible to unsee. Link 12, Jara-marana, aging and death. Conditioned by birth, aging, and death. And the Vibhanga Sutta here, unusually, gives us more than a definition. It gives us a cascade. And the cascade is where the suffering the Buddha has been tracing finally shows its full face. Aging, he says, is decrepitude, brokenness, graying, wrinkling, decline of life force, weakening of faculties. Death is the passing away, the breakup of the aggregates, the casting off of the body, the interruption of the life faculty, SN 12.2. These are the physical facts. But then the sutta adds 5 more tones, 5 consequences of aging and death, and each of them matters. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, despair. 5 tones, each named, each carrying its own weight. Sorrow, the inner grief. Lamentation, the outward cry. Pain, the bodily suffering that accompanies the ending of bodies. Distress, the mental affliction, the troubled mind. Despair, the deepest of them, the collapse of hope. And here is the move. In the moment-to-moment reading of the chain, these aging and death tones do not only apply to the aging and death of the body, they apply to the aging and death of every self that was born at link 11. The self of the one who was wronged has a lifespan, a few minutes, maybe an hour, maybe a day if you carry it home. And then it ages. Its grip weakens. Its world begins to lose solidity. And then it ends, to be replaced moments later by another self, born into another world, which will age and end just as quickly. Every self that is born ages. Every self that ages dies. And every one of those small deaths, the Buddha is saying, carries the 5 tones. There is sorrow at the ending of a position. There is lamentation at the loss of a role. There is pain when the self that was defended cannot survive. There is distress. There is despair. Each birth costs a death, and the cost is the 5 tones. This is the moment for the canon's own phrase, said with the full weight of what has just been described. Such is the origination of this entire mass of stress and suffering. Not just the origination of one suffering, in one moment, in one meeting. The origination of the entire mass. All of it, the whole of it. Every self that is born and dies in you, thousands of times a day, and the accumulation of their small griefs into the long grief of a life. 12 links. The machinery has turned. Act 3. The weakest link. 12 links, 11 of them producing the 12th. And at the end, the canon's own phrase, such is the origination of this entire mass. But there is a question we have been setting aside. If the chain is not a wheel, if Thanissaro is right that it is a complex system with multiple points of leverage, then where is the most strategic point? Where in the 12 links does the structure bear the least weight? Where is the weakest link? The Buddha answers this question in the same sutta, where he warned Ānanda against treating this teaching as shallow. In the Maha-nidana Sutta, he does something remarkable. He describes not one chain, but two parallel sequences of craving and its consequences. The first is the personal chain we have been tracing. Craving gives rise to clinging, clinging to becoming, becoming to birth, birth to aging and death. The second is a social chain. Craving, the Buddha says, gives rise to seeking. Seeking to acquisition. Acquisition to ascertainment, the judgment of this as mine. Ascertainment to desire and passion. Desire and passion to attachment. Attachment to possessiveness. Possessiveness to stinginess. Stinginess to defensiveness. And defensiveness, the Buddha says, ends in the taking up of sticks and knives, in conflicts and quarrels and disputes, in accusations and divisive speech and lies. DN 15. Two chains. One ends in the death of an individual, the other ends in war. And then the Buddha says something I find, after 2,500 years, still stunning. He says these two chains, the personal chain ending in aging and death, and the social chain ending in knives and lies, flow back into one place. They converge, and the place they converge is feeling. Vedana. Link 7, DN 15. Feeling is where your private suffering and the world's violence meet. This is why feeling is the weakest link. Not because it is small, but because it is leveraged. Everything upstream of it is largely sub-intentional. Fabrications, consciousness, name and form, sense media, contact. Too fast and too infrastructural to catch. Everything downstream of it is already engaged. Craving has fired. Clinging is taking in. The machinery of becoming and birth and death is turning. Between these two zones, between contact that is too fast to catch and craving that is already too late, there is a narrow gap, a single breath, maybe less. And in that gap, a tone has arisen and not yet been named as mine. That gap is where practice lives. Without mindfulness, the gap does not appear. A feeling arises, pleasant, painful, neutral, and it is instantly identified as mine, instantly met with a pull toward or against, and the downstream machinery engages before awareness has had a chance to notice anything at all. With mindfulness, the gap opens. The feeling arises, and before it is identified as mine, there is a noticing. This is a feeling. It has arisen. It is inconstant. It is to be known. That quality of attention, what the suttas call appropriate attention, yoniso manasikara, does something that sounds small, but that turns out to reach all the way back to link one. Because at the moment you attend to a feeling as a feeling that has arisen and will pass, you are, for that instant, no longer operating under ignorance. You are knowing stress. You are knowing the origination of stress. You are knowing, in germ, that stress can cease. Every time you see a feeling clearly, you are weakening the first link of the chain by touching the seventh. The Buddha's canonical picture of what happens in this gap, and what happens when the gap is missed, is given in the Two Arrows Sutta. An uninstructed person, the Buddha says, is struck by a painful feeling. They sorrow, they grieve, they lament, they beat their breast. They feel, the Buddha says, two pains, the bodily pain and a mental pain added on top of it, like being shot by an arrow, and then, in the same instant, being shot by a second arrow in the same place. A well-instructed disciple is struck by the same painful feeling, and they feel one pain, the bodily pain, not the mental pain. One arrow, not two, SN 36:6. The first arrow is the price of having a body. The second arrow is optional. What the noble disciple sees, that the uninstructed person does not see, is, in the Buddha's list, the origination, the passing away, the allure, the drawback, and the escape from feeling. 5 features. They are not a meditation technique. They are 5 facets of what appropriate attention at link 7 actually does. It sees that the feeling arose. It sees that it will pass. It sees what pulled at it. It sees what the pull would cost. And it sees that there is a way not to be pulled. And when these 5 are seen clearly and repeatedly, what Thanissaro argues in The Shape of Suffering, and this, again, is my paraphrase of his position, not a verbatim quote, is that one need not grasp the entire 12-link sequence to escape it. Insight into any one factor, sustained and clear enough to see its arising and its passing, its allure and its drawback, can begin the process of disentanglement. The chain is complex. That complexity is precisely what makes it dismantleable. Stand clearly at any one of its links, and the system begins to undo itself. One honest note before we close. I have been describing the chain as it operates moment to moment in daily experience. A later commentarial tradition, developed centuries after the Buddha, the most influential statement of it is in Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga, written in the 5th century of the Common Era, reads the 12 links across 3 lifetimes. Ignorance and fabrications from a previous life. Links 3 through 10 in this life. Birth and aging and death in the next life. This is a substantial, orthodox reading, and Thanissaro does not reject it. He holds it alongside the moment-to-moment reading, arguing that the same 12 factors operate at different timescales because of the chain's self-similarity. A moment is like an evening, is like a life, is like a series of lives. If you hold to literal rebirth, as Thanissaro does, the chain runs across lifetimes too. If you are looking at the afternoon in front of you, it also runs right here. This breath, this contact, this feeling tone not yet named. And the Buddha did something very early in his teaching career that is worth remembering as we move toward the close. In the first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the monk Kondanya listened to the exposition of the 4 noble truths, and the text says a vision arose in him. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation, SN 5611. That single insight, clearly seen, was the canon's description of stream entry, not the mastery of all 12 links. One insight into the nature of arising and ceasing. That was enough to begin the work of the chain's undoing. ACT 4. Cessation plus closing anchor. The canon does not leave the chain at its origination. In the same sutta in which the 12 links are defined, the Buddha runs the chain a second time, in reverse, and the wording of the reversal is careful. From the remainderless fading and cessation of that very ignorance comes the cessation of fabrications. From the cessation of fabrications, consciousness ceases. From the cessation of consciousness, name and form ceases. And so on through all 12 links, in reverse, each cessation conditioning the next. The sutta ends as the forward version ended, but inverted. Such is the cessation of this entire mass of stress and suffering. SN 12:2. 2 words in that formula are worth sitting with. Remainderless fading. The Pali is asesa viraga. Fading, viraga, comes first. Cessation, nirodha, is second. The chain does not snap. It is not cut. It dims. Its grip weakens until it has no grip. And then, at some moment that cannot be pointed at from outside, the chain no longer has the power to sustain itself, and it ceases. The teaching is careful about what happens next. The canon does not offer much positive phenomenology of cessation. The Buddha, when he speaks of it, tends to speak by subtraction. What ceases, what is no longer, what is not sustained. I want to honor that restraint ignorance ceases, which means the fabrications that were built out of ignorance cease, which means the consciousness conditioned by those fabrications, the name and form shaped by that consciousness, the sense media organized by that name and form, the contact that ran through those sense media, the feeling that arose at that contact, the craving that reached from that feeling, the clinging that fed on that craving, the becoming that formed around that clinging, the birth of a self into that becoming, and the aging and death of that self with its 5 tones of sorrow and lamentation and pain and distress and despair, all cease. Not because they were killed, because they are no longer being produced. We began this episode with a daytime scene, a meeting, a sentence, a contraction in the chest, a self born into a room it had not occupied 5 seconds earlier. I want to close with the Buddha's own image of where the chain actually runs, not in the cosmos, not on a wheel, not across 3 lifetimes strung together through realms of rebirth, in one place. It is just within this fathom-long body with its perception and intellect. He told the Deva Rohitasa that I declare that there is the cosmos, the origination of the cosmos, the cessation of the cosmos, and the path of practice leading to the cessation of the cosmos. AN 445. Fathom-long body, the length of your outstretched arms, the span of the body you are sitting in right now. The 12 links are not a map of the universe. They are a map of the next moment. The territory is the same territory you are sitting in right now. This breath, this contact, this feeling tone not yet named. The chain runs here. The cessation begins here.